For more than 100 years, the entire American West, its cities, its farms, its dazzling, improbable civilization built in the desert, rested on a single agreement. It was a promise, struck in 1922 among 7 states, to share the waters of the Colorado River. That agreement is the reason Los Angeles could grow into a megacity. The reason Phoenix and Las Vegas could rise from the sand. The reason the deserts of California and Arizona could become some of the most productive farmland on Earth. It was the foundational deal, the one that made everything else possible. And now, after a century of holding the West together, that deal has officially come apart. The 7 states that share the river tried, for more than a year, to agree on how to manage it as it shrinks, and they failed. They blew through deadline after deadline, one after another, and in the end, for the first time in the modern history of the river, the federal government had to step in and impose its own rules, because the states simply could not agree among themselves. This is the story of how the deal that built the American West fell apart, why it was doomed from the very beginning, and what happens now that the century-old promise of enough water for everyone has finally, undeniably, broken. To understand the magnitude of what just happened, you have to understand what this deal actually was, because it was far more than a simple contract. In 1922, representatives of the 7 states in the Colorado River Basin gathered to divide the river's water among themselves. They split the basin into 2 halves, an upper basin of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, where most of the river's water is actually born in the snowpack of the Rockies, and a lower basin of Arizona, Nevada, and California, where most of the people and farms that use the water are located. Each half was granted a share, and over the following decades, a whole edifice of additional treaties, court rulings, and laws was piled on top of that original compact, a towering structure that people came to call, almost reverently, the law of the river. This was the framework that governed everything. It told each state how much water it could take. It enabled the construction of the great dams, Hoover and Glen Canyon, and the reservoirs behind them, Lake Mead and Lake Powell. It was, in every meaningful sense, the Constitution of the American West, the document that turned a wild desert river into the engine of a civilization. Consider for a moment just how much was built on that foundation, because the scale is almost difficult to comprehend. The water divided by that century-old agreement now sustains close to 40 million people across the 2 nations, since the deal eventually grew to include a treaty guaranteeing a share to Mexico as well. It irrigates some of the most valuable farmland on the planet, the fields that grow a huge portion of the winter vegetables Americans eat and vast quantities of other crops besides. It supports an economy measured in the trillions of dollars, powering industries, filling swimming pools, and lighting the neon of Las Vegas. It provides for dozens of sovereign tribal nations whose ancestral claims to the river predate every state at the table. Cities that had no business existing in a desert, that receive only a few inches of rain a year, swelled into sprawling metropolises entirely because this deal guaranteed them a slice of a distant river. Nothing about the modern West, from its agriculture to its suburbs to its industry, would exist in its current form without that original act of division. It is not an exaggeration to say that the deal made the West, that the map of the American Southwest as we know it today was drawn not by nature, but by the terms of that agreement. But here is the fatal flaw, the crack that was built into the foundation from the very first day. When those men sat down in 1922 to divide the river, they divided water that did not actually exist. They based their entire agreement on measurements taken during an unusually wet stretch of years, and they assumed the river carried far more water than it truly does over the long run. They handed out shares adding up to more water than the Colorado reliably provides, promising the states, on paper, a bounty the river could not deliver in reality. It was a magnificent act of optimism, or perhaps of willful blindness, dividing up a pie that was smaller than everyone pretended. From that moment on, the deal contained a structural deficit, a permanent gap between what was promised and what actually flowed. The West was built, quite literally, on a mathematical error, a promise of abundance that the river was never able to keep. So why did it take 100 years for this flaw to bring the whole thing crashing down? The answer is that for decades, the great reservoirs hid the problem. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the two largest reservoirs in the United States, were enormous savings accounts of water, holding several years' worth of the river's flow between them. When the states collectively took more water than the river provided, the difference was quietly drawn down from these massive reserves, which had been filled during wetter times. As long as the reservoir stayed high, no one had to confront the underlying arithmetic. There was always a buffer, a cushion of stored water that absorbed the deficit and kept the promises flowing. The abundance in those reservoirs papered over the flaw in the deal, and the 7 states could mostly cooperate, or at least coexist. Because there was enough slack in the system that nobody yet had to face a truly painful cut. The math was broken, but the reservoirs were full enough that it did not seem to matter. And then, over the past 25 years, the buffer ran out. A punishing, relentless drought, made hotter and drier by climate change, settled over the basin and refused to leave. Year after year, the snowpack that feeds the river came in below normal, and the flow of the Colorado dwindled. The great reservoirs, no longer being replenished, began to fall and fall and fall. Lake Mead and Lake Powell dropped toward levels never seen since they were first filled, their combined storage sinking to the lowest point in generations, exposing bathtub rings of pale rock hundreds of feet high where the water used to be. The savings account that had hidden the deal's flaw for a century was being emptied, and as it drained, the underlying deficit was finally laid bare for all to see. By the summer in which the deal came apart, the two great reservoirs had fallen so far that their combined contents stood at the lowest level since the era when they were first being filled, more than half a century earlier. Together they sat at roughly a quarter of their total capacity, meaning that the vast concrete basins that were supposed to guarantee the West against drought were 3/4 empty. Each passing month brought new record lows, the water surface dropping to elevations that engineers had once discussed only as distant worst-case scenarios. And the science offered little comfort. The snowpack feeding the river was coming in far below normal. The parched soils of the basin were soaking up much of what little runoff there was before it could ever reach the reservoirs, and forecasters spoke openly of uncharted territory. Suddenly, there was no more slack, no more cushion. Every single gallon of the river was now spoken for and then some, and any water one state kept was water another state would lose. The abundance was gone, and with it went the easy cooperation it had quietly made possible. This is what set the stage for the collapse. The operating rules that had guided the river through the earlier years of the drought were set to expire at the end of 2026, which meant the 7 states had to negotiate a new set of rules for how to share the pain of a shrinking river. And this is where the deal that built the West finally broke. For more than a year, the states negotiated, and for more than a year, they deadlocked. The fault line ran exactly where the 1922 Compact had drawn it, between the Upper Basin and the Lower Basin. The Lower Basin states, which had already been absorbing deep and painful cuts, put forward a plan that involved further mandatory reductions, and they insisted that everyone, including the Upper Basin, had to share in the sacrifice. The Upper Basin states refused to accept mandatory cuts of their own, arguing that they had never even used their full share of the river and should not be forced to give up water they were still entitled to. Neither side would budge. The trust between them eroded, positions hardened, and the negotiations, conducted behind closed doors, ground toward a bitter stalemate. To understand just how far apart the two sides were, it helps to look at what was actually on the table. The Lower Basin states came forward with what they clearly regarded as a serious, even painful offer. They proposed that Arizona reduce its take of the river by more than a quarter, that Nevada cut nearly a fifth of its share, and that California give up a tenth of its historically protected allocation, an extraordinary concession from the state with the most senior and most defended water rights on the entire river. In their eyes, this was a dramatic show of good faith, a willingness to absorb enormous losses, and all they asked in return was that the Upper Basin accept some binding share of the sacrifice as well. But from the Upper Basin's perspective, the demand looked entirely different. The Upper Basin had never developed the infrastructure to use its full legal entitlement, and it argued that its people already went short in dry years, receiving less than their paper allocation whenever the snowpack failed. To sign up for fixed. Mandatory cuts on top of the shortfalls nature already imposed struck them as being asked to pay twice for the same crisis. So the very offer the lower basin saw as generous, the upper basin saw as a trap, a clever way to lock in the downstream city's consumption while capping the upstream state's future forever. The two halves of the basin were not just haggling over numbers. They were operating from fundamentally incompatible understandings of what fairness even meant. The deadlines came, and the states blew through them one after another. A first deadline to produce a framework passed with nothing to show for it. A second, firmer deadline, set by federal officials, arrived, and still there was no agreement. One of the lead negotiators stated bluntly that there was simply no deal. In a last-ditch effort, the federal government convened the governors of all 7 states directly, hoping that leadership at the highest level could break the impasse where the negotiators had failed. It did not work. The governors met, and still no consensus emerged. Month after month, the most important shared resource in the American West sat suspended over a void, with the people whose job it was to manage it unable to agree on how. And so, at the end of it all, the thing that everyone had hoped to avoid finally happened. With the states hopelessly deadlocked and the deadline for new rules bearing down, the federal government stepped in and released its own plan, imposing a framework for operating the river's reservoirs because the states had proven incapable of writing one themselves. To grasp why this is such a historic rupture, you have to appreciate how the river had always been governed before. For a century, the defining principle was that the states would solve their own problems. The West prided itself on this, on the idea that the people of the basin, not distant federal bureaucrats, would sit down together and work out how to share their river. The whole culture of Colorado River management was built on consensus, on the belief that 7 sovereign states could always, eventually, find a compromise. That belief was the real deal, the deeper agreement beneath all the legal documents, the promise that the West would govern itself cooperatively. And that is precisely what just shattered. The federal imposition of a plan is not merely a bureaucratic event. It is the failure of the cooperative model itself, the moment the states admitted, by their paralysis, that they could no longer do the one thing the entire system depended on. The West, which had always insisted it could manage its own water, discovered that when scarcity finally bit hard enough, it could not. Now, it is important to be precise and honest about what has and has not fallen apart, because the truth is more nuanced than any single dramatic phrase can capture. The original 1922 compact has not been formally torn up or repealed. As a matter of law, the law of the river still technically stands, and the federal plan that was imposed is in part a temporary bridge. A shorter-term set of operating rules layered within a longer framework, deliberately designed to leave the door open for the states to keep negotiating a more lasting agreement down the road. So this is not the total legal dissolution of the West's water framework, but what has genuinely and unmistakably broken is the thing that made that framework function: the cooperative, consensus-based process by which the states govern themselves. The machinery of voluntary agreement seized up and failed, and the federal government had to take the wheel. The letter of the old deal survives, but its living spirit, the shared willingness to solve the problem together, is what has come apart. It would be easy, in telling this story, to cast one side as the villain. But the honest truth is that both the upper and lower basins have serious, legitimate arguments, and understanding them is the key to understanding why no compromise could be found. The lower basin's position is compelling. Its states are home to most of the basin's people and farms. They have already endured the deepest mandatory cuts, and they argue with real force that a crisis of this magnitude demands that everyone contribute, that it is simply unfair for one half of the basin to keep taking its full share while the other half bleeds. But the upper basin's position is equally serious. Those states point out that they have historically used far less than their legal entitlement, that the river's shortfalls already fall on them first because they live closest to where the dwindling snowpack actually lands, and that being forced to cut water they have not even been using would mean sacrificing their own future growth to sustain the sprawling cities and farms downstream. Each side sees the other as demanding an unfair sacrifice. each side believes it is being asked to give up more than justice requires. And because both arguments are rooted in a century of law, history, and genuine need, there was no obvious middle ground, no compromise that did not feel, to one side or the other, like a betrayal. So what happens now, with the old deal broken and a federal plan imposed over the objections of states that never agreed to it? The most immediate danger is litigation. For years, the states have been quietly assembling legal teams, preparing for the possibility that if negotiation failed, they would fight it out in court instead. A lawsuit over the fundamental meaning of the 1922 Compact could end up before the nation's highest court, and such a battle could drag on for years, even decades, freezing the basin in uncertainty while the reservoirs continue to fall. Nearly everyone involved understands that this is the nightmare scenario. A courtroom war would consume enormous time and money, poison the relationships between the states, and, most damning of all, it would do absolutely nothing to change the underlying reality. As one coalition of conservation groups pointedly warned, conflict will not change the hydrology. No judge, however powerful, can order more snow to fall in the Rockies. The river will keep shrinking regardless of who wins in court, which means that even a total legal victory for one side would be, in the largest sense, a hollow one. There is a particular reason the courtroom is so frightening to everyone involved, and it lies in the deep uncertainty about what a judge would actually decide. The 1922 Compact and the century of law built on top of it have never been fully tested in the extreme conditions the basin now faces. No one truly knows how a court would interpret the Upper Basin's core obligation to deliver water downstream when there is simply not enough water to both meet that obligation and sustain the upstream states. A ruling could go in almost any direction, and it could upend assumptions that entire cities and industries have been built upon. That radical unpredictability is a danger to everyone. Each state, however confident in its legal position, has to reckon with the possibility of a catastrophic loss. In theory, this shared fear of the unknown is exactly what should drive the states back to the negotiating table, since a compromise they design themselves is far safer than a verdict imposed by a judge who understands water law but not the intricate realities of their communities. Yet that same fear can also make each side dig in harder, terrified of appearing weak. Gambling that the other will blink first, the federal plan now in place buys a little time, a temporary scaffolding to keep the river operating while the states decide whether to keep fighting or to try, once more, to find the agreement that eluded them. And that points to the deepest meaning of what has just happened, the reason this is about so much more than water law. The collapse of this deal marks the end of an entire era, the era of assumed abundance. For a century, the West operated on the unspoken belief that there would always be enough, that the river's bounty was effectively limitless, that growth could continue forever, and the water would somehow be found. The 1922 deal was the ultimate expression of that faith. A confident carving up of a resource everyone assumed was plentiful. What is broken is not just a set of operating rules, but that entire worldview. The West must now do something far harder than dividing up plenty. It must learn to negotiate scarcity, to decide not who gets to grow, but who has to shrink. Dividing abundance is a happy task. There is enough for everyone to feel like a winner. Dividing scarcity is a zero-sum ordeal, where every gain for one is a loss for another, and it demands a maturity, a willingness to sacrifice for the common good that the recent negotiations revealed the basin does not yet possess. It is one thing to share a feast, and another thing entirely to divide a famine, and the West has just discovered, painfully, that the habits and institutions built for the first are wholly unsuited to the second. In the end, the deal that built the American West was at its heart a promise that 7 states could share a great river, that the desert could bloom, that there would be enough water for everyone who came. For 100 years, propped up by full reservoirs and generous assumptions, that promise mostly held. But a promise built on water that was never really there could only last as long as the illusion of abundance did, and that illusion has now finally completely evaporated, drained away with the falling reservoirs and the vanishing snow. The old deal has fallen apart not because the lawyers failed or the politicians were stubborn, though both of those things are true. But because reality caught up with a bargain that was always more hope than arithmetic, the river simply no longer carries the water the deal assumed. Whether the West can now forge a new agreement, one built honestly on the river as it actually is, rather than as its founders wished it to be, is the great open question hanging over 40 million people. The fall of the old deal is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the hardest chapter the American West has ever faced, learning, at last, to live within the limits of a river that can no longer keep the promises